I'm Kayne, CISO in residence at Hyperproof, and I'm joined today by Brittney Harrell, Head of Information Security at Nabla. Welcome to the show, Brittney.
Thank you, Kayne. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so glad that you were able to join us, and because this is a live stream, if you in the audience have got a question for Brittney or a question about Nabla or a question about Hyperproof, please drop it in the comments on either LinkedIn or on YouTube, and we're going to take these as we go. And today is the first day of summer here in the United States, and I'm currently doing the show you're from Washington State without saying you're from Washington State because I'm wearing a sweater. Brittney, how is it out where you're located? Are you at least having something approximating summer?
Yeah, so I'm in Kansas City, Missouri, smack in the middle, and I want to emphasize I said Missouri. But yeah, it's very hot, but that's typical Midwestern summers.
And this is our typical January type weather pattern that we're having, but that's okay. We do look forward to it. So today we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, and I just want to set a grounding question for our audience so that they can understand what we're talking about. So in your opinion, Brittney, how should security professionals work through I guess I'd say ambiguous terminology around artificial intelligence? Like, I don't know if we all have a consistent definition, or if regulators or if attorneys have consistent definitions of what the heck is artificial intelligence. And then what are the challenges that creates for organizations that are trying to do a risk assessment?
Yeah, so unfortunately right now there's really no consistency with AI, even the terminology that's used. That's kind of hard, I think, for any professional, but specifically security. We in security usually have to know a wide range of topics, and we combat that with also staying up with emerging threats. AI is really no different because it's rapidly changing. And so my best advice is to make it personal. So apply it to your current situation, your current organization, how you use AI in your work life, your personal life. That's the best way to start with AI. There's a lot of good public resources out there like Berkeley AI blog, LinkedIn Learning, Coursera. So don't expect yourself to be an AI expert, because truthfully, there's really no AI expert right now because it's changing. I would also suggest having a group of people, whether that's inside your company, outside. So the best way that I've been able to ingrain myself in AI is to talk to other community members, get their perspective. And if you're in an organization, standing up an AI committee is really smart because it touches a lot of spaces, not just cybersecurity, but legal, data, operations, sales. And so basically I'm saying, get yourself a community to go along for this crazy ride.
I think that's a really good piece of advice there for our audience, just right at the top. And we're going to start talking through some of these varying regulatory and legal definitions, and also some of the impacts that they have here. And just as a reminder, if you've got questions for Brittney about this, or if you've got questions for me, do drop those in the chat on LinkedIn or YouTube. And I want to start by talking about California, just to kind of start with here, because California often domestically in the United States tends to lead the nation when it comes to regulatory developments, and often those are and laws, and often those are adopted by other states, not necessarily the federal government, but often it's adopted by other states, or often states that do business with California because of interstate commerce. Like, you end up having to adopt it anyway. So let's talk about California. They have a pretty changing, it's a kind of I'm still not quite sure I'm tracking what they're defining AI as, because they're trying to relate artificial intelligence to things like employee thresholds and compliance efforts for larger entities. How should organizations start trying to tackle what California is doing right now?
Yeah, so California is interesting. You're right. It usually sets the precedence of what's to come. The California AI Transparent Act is kind of the first of its kind. We are seeing already other states follow suit. It's interesting because they're very vague with their definitions, and I don't necessarily think that's a California problem. I think that's us as a society hasn't quite figured out AI yet. A perfect example is we call a lot of things AI when it's probably not artificial intelligence. It's probably just really sophisticated data. My best advice here is, first of all, don't try to do it yourself. There are organizations out there that are dedicated to this, like CHI, IAPP. If you guys want specific resources, I mean, reach out. I can give them to you. where they actually will break down the regulations. I am a security professional. I am not a legal professional. I do not understand legal terms sometimes. And so it kind of puts it more into layman terms of what to understand. Once again, apply it to your current situation. So right now, the California AI Transparency Act is very focused on what we call high risk AI.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they don't necessarily define high risk AI well yet, and that's because no one really has yet. So the way that you interpret it is going to matter. Like, do you consider yourself a high risk AI? I don't know. It's up to the organization. On that front, I always say go with the most stringent that you can, because to your point, there's going to be other states that come in. These regulations are going to change, and you're going to have to be ready regardless. And then my second point is document your stance. So if you decide that this California regulation is not in scope for you for whatever reason, document it, document the why, be able to stand behind it. Because when you have clients and vendors that start asking you, how are you complying with AI regulations, you can use that. And then as California changes, you can use that as well.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point there on documentation and ensuring that there is consistent documentation and it's consistently up to date and hopefully being, I could imagine a scenario where people go, well, it's documentation about the use of AI, so let's just have an AI write it, right?
Yeah.
That's
Oh, yeah, don't do
probably
that.
not going to be a great outcome for anybody, although it could produce some comedy gold in the courts. But I'd say that ultimately having that documented process by which you made the determination of how a given reg or a given law applied to your entity or organization, I think that really does matter. And I think also if there's anything we've learned in the past decade of litigation over cybersecurity matters and privacy matters, having folks sign that really does help, because then you can say, well, here's the framework by which we made this determination, and
Yes.
we all agreed as an organization, and so there's no ambiguity over who said what. It becomes very clear and concise, and that way an organization, if they have a material incident, if they have a data breach, if they have a lawsuit, if they have whatever, they can say, we followed our process. And I think something we've seen, and maybe we want to talk about this, is that provided you have a defined process by which and you followed your process, I think with newer technologies that courts and legislators have been more forgiving than if you just like YOLO'd it or Jerry in the basement told you this is the way you did it, rather than having a consistent framework. Has that been your experience too, Brittney?
Definitely, and especially with emergent technologies. I mean, we all have to remember we're all in the same boat here. AI is new for all of us. There's no expert in AI that's been around for 10 plus years because it hasn't truly existed. So, if you come back and say, I followed my process, here's my reasoning, here's my documentation, I have a standard, you really can't argue that because there is no federal framework right now to follow. I think what a lot of people want right now is just transparency and trust. They don't expect you to be experts, but they expect you to just be open and honest of your stance.
Yeah, although I do think that transparency and trust is something that can cause organizations to uh, backpedal. I think when they are transparent, I can think of a recent case. A recent how do I describe this? So there's a situation going on at a company. How about that? I won't say who, but anyway, they decided that they'd take a whole bunch of money from an AI vendor, and they said, hey, this is a great thing, and transparently said it. And all of the folks who are their customers and their suppliers said, yeah, actually, no, we don't want to have anything to do with you anymore.
Yeah.
And they all just like lifted and shifted and went away because they realized that they did not want their data to be processed or training somebody else's AI. And now I'm watching this entity backpedal heavily from their initial public stance of AI is good. And I think my point there is that companies, when they think about this transparency and trust, which I do agree is important, you have to have a plan for what happens if, like, you should game this out of what happens if everybody says, no, we don't want this feature. I'm thinking of, do you remember Microsoft's recall when it first was announced?
Yes.
Yeah, right. And for those of you who are on the live stream who don't remember Microsoft's recall, which is only now coming out, the first idea is we are going to record everything that's on your screen in Windows. and it'll be on, and it won't be encrypted, and it'll be stored in your local user account so that you can look up stuff that you were looking at previously on your computer. And that sounds good, right? And inevitably, security and privacy researchers realized that was probably not the best thing, to start storing credit card numbers and expiration dates and personally identifiable information and highly sensitive corporate data and all kinds of other things
Yeah.
in some unencrypted database that somebody could, if they can get into your account, they could just like wander away with. And so Microsoft had to actually, and they're a company, they're not new at this. They had to do crisis communications, they had to pivot, they had to walk it back. And I think now they've come up with a better approach to recall. I think that that's something we're going to see, though, as organizations make these transparency statements, right, Brittney, where they may have to deal with public blowback.
Definitely. So I think a huge part of the AI lifecycle is marketing and PR, just like product strategies. So, coming out and saying, we're going to start processing all your data to train a model without understanding your market and your client base and your regulatory requirements, it's really not a smart move. So having core conversations with some of your like trusted advisors, trusted clients, that's really the way to go to say, hey, if we were to start doing this, what would be your reaction? You should always do that before you do publicly. But yes, I do think that so AI terminology, like we talked about, is so vast. There's all these buzzwords being thrown out, like machine learning, agentic AI, all these things, and making sense of what they mean sometimes, that's part of the problem. And so having a strong marketing and PR team where you can explain what it is that you're going to do, how you want to do it, what your goals are, that's a huge part of this, because we as
Mm-hmm.
consumers want to understand where our data is.
I agree absolutely on that one. So I want to go back just to California to finish out that conversation. So I'd say their regulatory landscape's currently not settled. I think they're still working it through. So what should organizations do when they're thinking about adoption of AI? Should they just charge hard at it and throw money at it and hope that they can run ahead of any future regulation? Or should they actually be tracking what California is doing and still trying to innovate while predicting what they might need to do from a compliance perspective?
So we're seeing a drastically different approach to AI at the state level because, like we talked about, there's no federal. You've got some states who are highly regulated, like California and Colorado. And then you have some states who say, I don't want to regulate anything, I don't want to halt innovation. And I think long term, we're going to end up somewhere in the middle. But for right now, my best advice is to go with the most stringent state, a California or a Colorado, which I know we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And the reason being is you want to understand the highest bar that you have to hit. You may not have to hit it down the road. So my best advice is to go through that and understand what the requirements are and where you fit in that. And I also want to reiterate, it's not just do you develop AI. Obviously, you'll have to abide by standards there, but it's also, do you deploy AI? So do you use AI tools in your environment? That's still in scope. So truthfully, I don't know a lot of organizations that aren't using some form of AI, ChatGPT, meeting notes. So either way, you should be looking at this with the lens of what am I going to have to meet to the highest standards?
That's a fair point. And I want to go back to something earlier you mentioned. The approach at the state level towards AI and enabling innovation versus stifling innovation, having more laws versus having less laws, kind of reminds me of GDPR, where
Yes.
in the European Union there is a very consistent, like, y'all are doing it this way. We're not doing a state by state approach for member states of the EU. And domestically here in the United States, privacy is just an absolute nightmare in the absence of any federal standard. I'm hearing that AI might trend that way right now. But let's talk about Europe, because they also have an AI Act, and I feel like they've tried to define what high risk AI is, and I think like social profiling is one of those things that they said is a high risk thing, which is why China probably won't sign on. But what are some of the steps that organizations could take if they're going to be subject to the EU AI Act, given some of the challenges around their own definitions of what is AI?
Yeah, I mean, the EU AI Act is a little bit similar to California in that they have tried to implement definitions, but AI is so vast that you don't fit in a perfect little box. Where AI, or where the EU AI Act has done things that I think in a very smart manner is one, they're doing a rolling implementation. So they aren't requiring everything up front from all organizations. That's a smart move because these regulatory acts that we're talking about, none of them have truly gone into full effect. And it's nice to put a theory out in practice, but then when you actually have to do it and you have to submit for it and you have to document it, you're going to get a lot of public feedback. Trust me, I have some public feedback to give California. So that's smart because you're almost building in a testing user base to say, how is this going to go and how should we transform it to the next layer? I like that they've done that. I wish that some of our states would take that approach because I think it gives us a testing period to really see how this is going to go. The other smart way that the EU AI Act has approached this is they have defined not just high risk, but certain categories.
Hmm.
So, industries, which is really smart because if you're in healthcare, which is what I'm in, you're automatically probably considered high risk because of the outcomes. I think that makes it easier for people to define that because we, as corporate organizations look at things by industry. And so that helps you kind of define, yes, I am in scope for this. Here's what I need to look at. I agree with you. I don't think we're going to have a US federal framework for a while, unfortunately. I think we are going to be state run, which
Hmm.
unfortunately is very, very fragmented. But long term, I think we will end up very similar to the EU AI Act.
And you bring up a really good point that I want to bring in an audience question. I want to thank the audience. If you've got questions for Brittney or for me or about our organizations or about AI, go ahead and we will not use ChatGPT to answer these. Promise. The question from the audience, and it's related to what you're saying here, is are startups at a disadvantage compared to larger organizations that can absorb compliance costs? And just thinking about what you were saying there, Brittney, around how we may have a state by state framework where organizations need to make either a high watermark or high bar determination like we did with GDPR, or they might choose to go state by state. Does that put startups at a disadvantage?
So, yes and no. I work at a startup today. From the standpoint of you don't have major teams dedicated to regulatory tracking and you don't have massive budgets for external certifications, there's even an AI certification out there from ISO. Yes, it does put startups at a disadvantage because you typically run very lean. And also figuring out who should own AI at your company is often very difficult because there's not a lot of smaller organizations that have a dedicated AI officer. Where they benefit is startups run really lean. So if a regulation changes, which it will, you can pivot your strategy very quickly, whereas large organizations cannot. You may need years to define how you're going to change up your product. So you have to look at it that way. Again, my best advice is even at a small company, at a startup, you can do this. Assign a couple people that either have interest in AI, have more of a tech background, who can understand software engineering, and form a committee and just start talking through some of these things. You don't have to have these massive AI and regulatory teams in order to do that.
I think that's a fair point. And the other thing I'd add into that is having a defined framework for making determinations
Yes.
is really important. And that means that hopefully it's fact-based, hopefully it's documented, and hopefully there's a agreed upon, because you mentioned a committee, there's a means by which of making a decision
Yes.
ultimately, as opposed to just creating bureaucracy, which is something that startups historically don't enjoy. I think that's why many of us go to startups, because there is less bureaucracy. But I'd
Yes.
say if you're looking at like trying to figure out AI, make sure that there is a process, say what it is, and don't just use AI to YOLO it. Because again,
Yeah, don't ask ChatGPT to come up with your committee meeting minutes and yeah, exactly.
although there is actually a case that I'm tracking now. I track a lot of cases around call transcription services, and it's in California. I think I'll have that on LinkedIn next week. Anyway, it's one of those things where people are unhappy with getting their calls transcribed, and consequently we get lawsuits. That may also inform, like some of the precedent that we're just establishing now may inform future strategies for companies. We do also have another question from the audience, and thank you, Tara, for putting the question in. And oh boy, this is exciting. It says, it feels like the federal government is always behind emerging technologies these days. Do you have any concerns about the lack of a regulatory framework around AI?
Oh boy.
Oh boy.
I do. So I think a lot of people, when you hear regulations, you think of monitoring, you think of they're trying to control me being creative and innovative. And that is the case sometimes, but really regulations are there to protect us as people and as consumers. When we don't have a federal framework, which is our current state right now, all of these states are going out and opening their own because they know that there's value there. Unfortunately, that's very fragmented because if you're a company that works across multiple states, you're probably asking yourself, okay, do I base it on where I'm based? Do I base it on my client base, my vendor base? And the answer is all of the above. That's very challenging. We wouldn't have to go through all of that pain if we had a federal framework. I do think that puts us at a disadvantage. Our current government thinks that the less we regulate, the more innovative we are, and we're seeing an opposite trend across the rest of the world. The rest of the world is moving toward regulation, so I do think we're behind. The best way to combat that is come up with your own organizational strategy. You don't have to rely on the government to do trust and transparency. You can still implement it yourself.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I'd add into that is the reason we get regulations, at least in the United States and some of the Western nations, I think Canada behaves in a fairly similar manner, is that you have enough negative outcomes
Yes.
that regulators or lawmakers get up, they bang their shoe on the table and say, we need to do a thing about this, which is why we now have data breach laws, lots of them at the state level. At the federal level, we have lots of regulations associated with those. And the reason we got all of that was bad stuff happened because companies decided, well, we can just, there's no law preventing this. It doesn't seem like a bad idea. So we should probably go ahead and either not put a control in place, or alternatively, we can continue behaving in this fashion because it's not necessarily illegal. And whether or not it's ethically, whether or not it's morally, is not really a conversation track that we have there. Is this permissible? And I'd say the absence of a federal standard for anything means you get different, as you said, organizational interpretations. And the challenge with
Yes.
those organizational interpretations is when we think about how that's going to affect risk management at the state level. Because if we continue having individual state by state things, that means that an organization could have something that's considered to be acceptable behavior in one space and unacceptable behavior in another space, and end up fighting lawsuits across multiple jurisdictions until there is some kind of established precedent coming out of probably an appeals court or the Supreme Court, although I doubt anything's going to hit that in any near term. Does
Yeah.
that sound fair, though? I think I like your idea of organizations, at least, they have to have a consistent definition of this is what we're doing. This is what's acceptable. This is what's not acceptable. Yeah?
Definitely. And the other thing I'll say there is not just from a documentation, privacy, regulatory standpoint, but just how we use AI and where it's going to go. So I'm going to age myself when I make this comment. It's kind of like when the World Wide Web blew up, and we got away from dial up and we had instant connections. I don't think us as a society understood what that was going to look like in 10 to 20 years. An example was now we have things at our fingertips, which is great because I get instantaneous news. Also
Mm-hmm.
bad because I'm under constant news fatigue. So AI is going to be very, very similar. And that, what does that mean for the future of us as a society? What we do now will impact 10 to 20 years later. And so we have to thoughtfully think through how do we want to constrain that to make sure that we're protecting society.
And with that, let's pivot to another state. Let's talk about, and I want to thank again the audience for the question. Please do drop these in the chat. They're the funnest part of this conversation, is getting to interact with the audience. But I want to talk about Colorado because you already mentioned that as another high watermark that folks are going to have to match. So we've talked about California. We've touched a little bit on the EU. Let's talk about Colorado because they have defined some new laws Although I'd say their definitions are still pretty fluid. So what should
Yes.
organizations do with, balancing that need to innovate in Colorado? Didn't they put
Yeah.
together like an innovation center proposal at one time?
They did. A lot of states are actually moving in that direction. So Colorado is probably the most controversial right now. A lot of pushback on that one. And it's not necessarily because of the vague definitions, because we see that across the board. It's more around some of the requirements that they've implemented. One that hits really close to home for me is around reporting to the general office of Colorado if you have an instance of discrimination or bias in your data. I get the concept. That's really important. We're heavily focused on that in AI. But again, implementing it is a lot harder.
Hmm.
So I'll use Nabla, where I work, as a perfect example. We are an ambient AI technology in healthcare. So essentially, clinicians use us when they're having a patient appointment, and it will transcribe the clinical note for them so they can focus more on their patient. If I think about like bias or anything like that, discrimination, so what if the doctor comes up with some kind of diagnosis for the patient based on their gender that's incorrect? Is that AI's fault? Is that the doctor's fault? Are we losing the fact that us as humans have bias built in automatically anyway? And so that's where it gets complicated, of how you actually implement that in practice, and how you report on that, and how you define it and produce metrics and outcomes for it is very, very difficult. And I think that's where there's a lot of pushback. But in the same breath, these kind of things that we're talking about, especially in a industry like healthcare and talking about health equity, you kind of have to be having these conversations. So with Colorado, I will say I would follow California a little bit closer than Colorado, because Colorado is getting major pushback here. Um, but it is important that you understand the public sentiment. So, and I mean, you can get on Reddit forums, you can Google it and see lots of opinions, but it's important to see that side, because it's going to track the direction that it's going to head, and you can be prepared for that as well.
Yeah, and just as a question on that, for the Colorado one, is that a voluntary disclosure or is that a mandated disclosure? And the reason that I ask is New York tried something like this 1 or 2 years ago, where they had a local law that said, look, if y'all have a discriminatory outcome from a applicant tracking system, an automated system that determines if somebody should apply or not apply or move forward in a hiring process. So they had a voluntary disclosure, like if you have discriminatory outcomes coming out of your AI-powered ATS, applicant tracking system, that you need to tell us. And you can imagine, like, nobody was like, hey,
Yeah,
we did
sorry,
a
my
bad.
bad.
Nobody came forward because it was voluntary. Is Colorado's voluntary or not?
Right now, it's mandatory, but for special circumstances. And this is
Hmm.
where definitions are changing, scopes are changing, because it hasn't gone into full effect yet. So originally it was anyone of a company bigger than 50 people. Now they've increased it to, I think, 500 people organization. So it's going to transform. Um, Again, regardless of what happens in that state, I would start having internal conversations of, do we know how to quantify discrimination? Does our tool even, have outputs of discrimination? Are we able to do that? Just start having the conversations, because it is going to come.
Excellent. Cool. Well, let's go on to the next topic here, just with that clarification, because we've been talking mostly about, I feel like mostly folks who develop AI, and I want to talk about people who are deploying AI, whether intentionally or sometimes unintentionally, because I think a lot of us who've got third-party systems or access to third-party products and systems, inevitably we're getting AI whether or not we wanted it. So let's think about third-party risk management first. Um, how should companies, how should organizations be looking at vendors who are putting AI into their product or into their service? And is there a difference here? Like, should we treat a vendor that says, hey, we're adding AI any different than any other vendor?
So, yes, I actually do think you should treat them differently. First and foremost, you need to build AI into your vendor management strategy. Now is the time. So if you have like an annual questionnaire that you send your vendors, start including AI questions. When you're reviewing contracts, start looking at how vendors use data. Do they use it to train models? Those are really important things. Now, just because a vendor uses AI in their product does not eliminate them. In fact, they could do it in a really secure way and it could, add a lot of efficiencies, but you need to start tracking that information. You need proof that you're looking into this stuff. It also begs the question of what if you use a vendor where you're completely reliant on them, like a data warehouse or core infrastructure? You're going to start asking yourself questions of, do I have control to say, no, I don't want this? And it can kind of influence your vendor strategy long term. I mean, as head of security, I've started thinking about, do I want to continue with this vendor if they're not willing to work with me on some of this? And then lastly, I think it's really important to think about it as yourself. So, what is your own organizational strategy and position? You might not have one yet, but do you want your employees to be able to use ChatGPT? Some companies do, some companies say hard no. Are you excited about security tools that use AI? Some people are saying absolutely not, it's too scary. You need to understand your own tone and how to deploy that to your vendors. Because if you're saying absolutely not, no AI to anything, are you requiring the same of your vendors? So you need to have your story straight before you start going into that path.
Well, I've got to ask if this is like SaaS adoption, software as a service, where initially I think a lot of companies were saying, well, we're all on premises. We've got our own data center. We don't want anything in your cloud, thank you. And then we went through an entire period of history where, and we're still kind of in that period, where everybody's got SaaS. Everything is software as a service. There is no longer the idea of you buy a license and it's a perpetual license and you install it on your hardware and you run it in your infrastructure. And the reason I say that is just recently Microsoft has announced as a product Azure as a thing you can install in your data center, right? That's kind of
Yes.
wild as a perspective, and it's because there's been enough pushback from customers saying, well, we don't want Azure running on your infrastructure. We want to run it on our own infrastructure in our own data centers, and I think that's predominantly in the European market. But are we going to have this cultural shift where we just assume everything's going to have AI, kind of like we ended up all accepting software is now sold in annual, sometimes a biannual license, and we have to continue subscribing? Or is there still an opportunity to say, no, we don't want AI in this stuff?
I think we're in a phase right now where we have the opportunity to say, no, we don't want AI in all this stuff. Now, do I think that's where it's going to end up? No, I do think AI will be in everything. We are still in the infancy stages, though. So that's why it's important to define what happens to that data. You can still have an AI product and
Mm-hmm.
not have data be a liability. An example is Nabla. So we're in the healthcare space. We made an active decision that we weren't going to train our model on patient data.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty rare for a healthcare model because you kind of need patient data to improve your model. So we do it in another form, but we did it because we knew us as consumers, especially as patients, especially in an industry where there's healthcare breaches all the time, we would rather put security and safety above just being able to train. So just because we're AI and we're an AI developer doesn't mean that we're using your data. You have to start looking at that. Just because somebody says I do AI doesn't mean that they don't have good protocols. And that's why you have to dig a little bit deeper. And I would also start advising to get your legal teams involved in terms of if they do use AI and if they do use your data to train their models, that's also maybe okay. Make sure they're not sharing it with any third parties. I don't know if you saw the article. There's a lawsuit going on right now between the New York Times and
Oh,
OpenAI.
yeah, that one's wild.
That's a really wild one. So basically, the lawsuit is the New York Times is saying that OpenAI needs to make all data available for the state of New York, even if a user has input it and then delete it after the fact. And OpenAI is pushing back and saying absolutely not. So that's a perfect example where OpenAI has taken a very big stance and said, we're not going to share this with anybody. And now you have a third party saying, you have to make this available to me. So not only do you need to talk about what you do today, but what is your future strategy if something comes out like this?
Yeah, and I just had to call up my newsletter. For those of you who aren't following my newsletter on LinkedIn, I write a newsletter. I covered the New York Times thing, I think that was last week's. And just for clarity, so the federal court ordered OpenAI to preserve all the ChatGPT conversations, including the deleted ones, but, and here's the but, it's only for free plus pro and team services.
Yep.
So if you have users in your organization who are putting stuff into ChatGPT and you're not on an enterprise plan, you're not on an education plan, and this includes API access, all that stuff is being subject to legal hold.
Yep.
Right? And I don't know how much time you spend around legal hold products, but boy, they are really interesting when you can do a data breach on one.
Oh, yeah.
I know I have some friends who do some things, and they've had some interesting stories with data retention and legal hold software. That's definitely a new risk for organizations to explore. But yeah, I'm now tracking that case in detail. Yeah. I want to go to an audience question because this actually is a good one to bring in. So we're talking about the idea of like our third-party services, do we have the ability to say no to AI? And the question from the audience is, can contractual clauses play a role in addressing liability and misuse of AI for vendors?
Absolutely. This is actually a really smart path to go. Now, your bigger vendors, you know, like your OpenAI, they're not going to negotiate because they just don't. They're too big. They're never going to let you. But with smaller organizations, so I'll give an example. We have an organization that's a support ticket tool for us. And they just released new AI features that would help us respond faster with tagging. And I was like, ooh, I'm really interested in that. But I want to know what you do with the data. Do you send it to third parties? And their response was, we do by default, but we have the ability to turn it off for you specifically. I was like, let's build it in the contract. I love it. So you have negotiation tactics. You can also build it in a contract where you say, yes, you may use my data. However, there are constraints here and we need to update our, you know, limited liability if there's a breach with AI data, all those things that, all those legal terms that I'll let you guys figure out. But that is a really good path for some of those smaller vendors where you can negotiate.
Yeah, I'd also add on to that, add the right to audit as part of
Yes.
that contractual negotiation. Because it's one thing to say, yeah, you can't YOLO our stuff into your training model and use it however, and then find out after the fact that they were doing that anyhow because they didn't have a compensating control. But I think by putting a right to audit as a negotiating tactic, that imposes a cost. And that actually creates reason for an organization, not to say that everybody doesn't uphold their contractual obligations, just not, you know, not everybody reads them even. So I'd say having that right to audit would probably reduce that risk substantially. Yeah?
Yeah, definitely. And if the organization doesn't want you to audit their systems, because I'm very anti that, you can have your certification and external audit vendors who do SOC 2, ISO, typically with like a SOC 2, you can have them add in additional context to say,
Mm-hmm.
yes, we did test where your data is being stored and who it's being sent to. And then you can send them the report and say, here's the proof.
And I like that. And the reason I was throwing out right to audit is a person who historically forces the cost of that back on customers. Oh, you want to audit us? Cool. Well, you can pay for that audit.
Fair.
Having an external attestation like an ISO 42001 to be able to show that you do have a reasonable risk management approach for artificial intelligence, I think that actually provides a lot more value. And if you're a CISO listening to this and thinking, hey, it would be nice if we had some more attestations so I don't have to answer all these questionnaires, maybe that's a reason for you to approach that. We do have another audience question too, and it's around the ability of AI to spread misinformation or disinformation in a fairly large scale way. What are the risks to organizations that are producing that? I want to set aside the distribution of content because I
Yep.
think that's already settled law. What about the creation of that misinformation content? Is there a risk there for organizations that they have to control? Like if you're an AI creator and I don't know, maybe you've made an AI video generator, is that a thing we have to do something about?
Definitely. I've seen a couple sectors. I mean, I'll use one that everybody knows, which is ChatGPT. So you can ask ChatGPT a question and it will spit out an answer. And you can ask the same question 5 minutes later and it will give you a different answer. And that's not necessarily because there's misinformation. It's just maybe the models behind the scenes are changing, but it could also be the data that's going into it. So I always say use AI tools to your benefit, but you have to have human in the loop involved. You have to. Even if you're asking ChatGPT, I saw a lawsuit a couple weeks ago where a lawyer asked ChatGPT to write a case summary for them and it made up a case and the lawyer went with it. And I was like, okay, so that's the perfect example where you use Google and you make sure that that's real. So, yes, you can use AI, but you need to understand that it's still in the infancy stages. You have to vet it. That is your responsibility of a user as a user of AI. And then also, yes, I mean, our current political state, we do have propaganda. It is going to exist in AI, not necessarily because of the AI, but because it's
Yeah.
using public sources to scrub information. So basically, vet everything you look at, which I think you should do regardless of AI or not.
Yeah, I think that to your point, we've had propaganda beforehand. I don't think Vladimir Putin was able to mass fire hose out disinformation
Yeah.
without AI. Like that is not a new behavior in Russia. So I think that that is not a new problem. But I do agree that yeah, having a human in the loop to make sure that anything your organization is disseminating actually is factual.
Yeah.
So I want to ask another question just around risk management because that's always a passion project of mine, and I always think about things in terms of risks. Are there any strategies that companies and organizations can use to make sure that their risk management frameworks are handling any of these new challenges from use of third-party AI, not first-party AI, but third-party AI?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of GRC tools out there. Also, Hyperproof, props to you guys. So there are tools out there that are kind of built for this,
Hmm.
where they will start analyzing risks based on your organizational posture, your industry, your risk appetite. So how much are you willing to take on? That's a really smart move in my opinion because us as security professionals are torn in a lot of directions and I don't want to manually sit down and figure this out. So, using a tool that can help you figure out what the risk is of AI, again, it's going to be very dependent on a lot of things. Where are your clients located? What is your industry? What kind of data do you store? I mean, it even comes down to are your organizational users tech savvy or not?
Hmm.
All of those things matter in a risk score. And so you want to start thinking about that. And the best way to do that is to find a framework that already exists. It's the same topic regardless of if it's AI in terms of risk. It's like, should I go buy this tool because I want to use it? Doesn't matter if it's AI or not. You're going to ask yourself the same questions.
Yeah, so I think we can apply a lot of what we've learned then from third-party risk management to be able to adequately manage the risks. And I suppose one other question here, and this is one that I've had um, a lot of conversations on. Does AI create new risks?
It does.
Okay. So what are the new risks you think that it creates? Because this is a curiosity of mine, because I can think of like one new type of risk that it creates, but other than that, not a lot.
So the one that I can think of most closely is hallucinations.
Hmm.
So making up things that didn't exist. So in the context of like my organization, so let's say that I have a conversation with my doctor and I say, I have this history of illness, and for some reason the AI heard me say that I have a family history of heart disease when I didn't. So
Hmm.
now my patient documentation says that I have a family history of heart problems and I don't. I mean, you can think about the implications of that. If
Right.
a human is hearing that, now us as humans are biased in some way, but us as humans don't just make up entire sentences. So that is a risk that exists with AI that I don't think ever existed before. Now, there are ways to combat that, which is human in the loop and reviewing
Hmm.
that and making sure
Hmm.
that's real. But we're going to see things like that where computers are doing things on behalf of people that won't necessarily be something that we would have considered before.
Yes, but no. I agree that it is a problem that an AI can hallucinate. I don't agree that that's a risk. And the reason why is that if an AI is hallucinating as a risk, then the world should be on fire right now. I
Fair.
think that the risk is that, as you just said, and you kind of led us to it, is that you could then have a regulatory problem, a
Yes.
risk of congressional oversight because of biased determinations made by an AI because it's hallucinating. But the hallucination itself is not a risk. It's kind of like in the cybersecurity space, a vulnerability, right? There's this big CVE, and it's like your software is now as secure as having screen doors on a submarine. Well, it's not actually a business risk unless it does something. If it's on some dev machine that nobody uses and has no access to the rest of your environment, there ain't no risk there. It's just a problem, and maybe you should go fix it, but it's not actually a business risk. I think that the business risk that gets exposed here, and you talked about it a little indirectly, is the risk of additional oversight or lawsuits resulting from incorrect AI determinations where there was, as you said, where we have to have a human in the loop.
Yes.
I think
And
that's something that, like, I've talked to a few folks about this on background of, hey, you're a CEO at a company, you have to sign off on your company's books annually under Sarbanes-Oxley. How would
yes.
you feel if an AI generated the whole thing and you could get rid of your internal audit team and you could save costs on your accountants, and nobody gets excited about that because they realize that if they are cooking the books, or if the AI is cooking the books, they're still the person who's going to jail, right? It
Yes.
is not the AI. We're not going to put an AI. I don't know if you can put an AI in jail. That feels like a Hollywood movie plot,
No.
right?
It's true. And so who's then on the hook for that? Is it the developer of the AI? Is it the backend model? What if you use it? I mean, there's so many implications that I can't think of. But there's also a societal impact, and we're not this far along yet. So, but this is coming as we start moving into like predictive AI. So, scans can predict whether you're going to have breast cancer in 5 years. What if it misdiagnoses you? You now have a patient safety problem. And
Mm-hmm.
so, who's at fault for that? Is it the developer? Is it the clinician? Is it the scan? I mean, we don't know yet. And so those are the kind of things that I think you have to think about of what is that goes back to my comment of like, we didn't fully understand the implications of the World Wide Web. Same for AI.
I think that's a very good point there, and I love the analogies that you're bringing in from healthcare. There's a question from the audience, and the way I think about this one is around crisis communications. And the
Mm.
question is if there should be a different escalation path for incidents involving AI generated content. So let's make up. Let's go with your scenario there. So the AI has said this person has a high risk of heart disease, right? So does there need to be a different escalation path there because the AI generated the determination that a patient has a high risk of heart disease, or is that in our existing escalation path?
So I think at this stage, no, you treat it the same because the outcome is the same regardless of where it originated from. But that's going to change over time, especially if you start having products that don't have human in the loop. So my answer right now is no, you treat it the same. It's still a crisis, whether it came from an agent or a person.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to start thinking about as AI transforms, and this is years down the road, what does your incident escalation look like? And I don't think us as security professionals know that yet.
And I don't necessarily know if we as security professionals are the right person to answer that question as well. I think we
Fair.
have a perspective on that question because goodness knows we have been involved in a lot of incidents, but not necessarily we are the arbiters of what the right thing is to do. I think that's a
Yes.
conversation where go have a cup of coffee with your favorite counsel at your company. I think that's all CISOs should honestly be friends with general
Yeah.
counsel.
Best friends with legal always.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We do have one other audience question. I love the level of audience engagement. Really appreciate this. This is so much fun. And the question is, if based on the increasing production of large language models and other models that are becoming so dynamic, do we still need AI integration in cybersecurity threats
Mm.
and system defense? And will AI still protect the future systems? Now, my crystal ball has been broken for years, unfortunately. What do you think?
I love this question. I actually kind of shock you because I'm here talking about AI regulations. Yes, I do think AI belongs in security. Um, Now, again, everything we talked about with caution. Have a
Hmm.
strategy, have it documented, understand what this vendor does. But AI can literally process data, especially large models, large language models. They can process data in formats and speeds that we as humans can't, which means they can hit us with threats a lot faster and in
Hmm.
mass volume. The really, truly only way to combat that is not with humans, it's with AI. I mean, look at phishing. Phishing is super sophisticated now because it's using machine learning, because it's using mass data models. They can send it out in mass volumes that humans can't do. So the best way to look at that is to scan it in rapid time because humans can't.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. I'm thinking of a situation I can't, well, um, I'll describe it vaguely. So I was, anyhow, we'll talk about the topic of tar pitting. And for those of you who aren't in cybersecurity, the topic of tar pitting is this. You have an adversary. Typically, it's a nation state. Often criminal gangs aren't quite at this scale. And they will hit you with everything all at once to try and overwhelm your defender's cognitive ability in order to determine what the actual problem was. And I can think of a scenario that I may or may not have been involved in and that may or may not be on the public record, where there was an organization that had an onbound phishing attack and a distributed denial of service attack.
Ooh.
There was a virus attack going on as well. There was a worm, because that was the thing back in the day, going on as well. And all of this was actually because there was an exfiltration thing happening. But it's kind of like the classic magician, watch my hand and don't watch
Yep.
what I'm doing with my other hand, right? And that's a classic tar pitting attack. I think that the organizations that lean into AI for that widespread signals intelligence and determination of what's actually important, I think at least that reduces the risk of being tar pitted effectively and running out of folks to make a determination of, hey, this is the real threat here. The rest of this is just noise. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. And it can look for patterns. Not that humans can't look for patterns, but we're torn in so many different directions. And it can take your systems and say, oh, look, somebody escalated, user access over here. And at the same time this is happening, we might not necessarily catch that that's interrelated, but AI can say, hey, there's something all going on in a uniform manner. And that's smart.
Yeah, I think that's a positive value associated with AI, at least in the security space. Now, I also would say that maybe it could write SOC analyst reports for incidents that were of low materiality. I think that's probably another benefit. But the rest of it, I think it's a little early, despite having been to Black Hat and RSA and going again to Black Hat. I'm going to see all the singing, all the dancing AI all the time, and I'm not sure how much of it's going to provide business value.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, again, I use ChatGPT to write summaries. Just make sure you read it and test it and make sure it's accurate.
Ooh, now what I just heard is that we can all get Brittany's content out if we can figure out how they're doing legal hold at ChatGPT. That's
Exactly.
exciting. I think with that, we're kind of hitting time. So I want to thank you today for being on the show, Brittany. And if you're watching this and if you know somebody who we should have on the show, or if you're watching this on the stream and you're like, hey, that conversation was so much fun, I want to be on the show, go ahead, drop a note in the comments or just DM me directly on LinkedIn. And with that, Brittany, I want to really thank you again for joining us and thank our audience for tuning in today's live stream.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.